She thought it was just a prank, but it turned into her biggest mistake. Watch what happened to. Rebecca Sanders stood in her backyard on a warm Saturday morning, hands planted firmly on her hips as she surveyed the rectangular outline marked with bright orange spray paint. At 46, she had finally saved enough from her job as a hospital administrator to install the swimming pool she dreamed of since childhood. 3 years after finalizing her divorce from Mark, this pool represented more than just luxury. It was a symbol of her independence and resilience. "It's going to be beautiful," said the contractor, a stocky man named Jim who had spent the morning explaining the excavation process. 16 by 32 feet, custom tile work around the edges, and those underwater lights you wanted. Your backyard's perfect for it. As they discussed the timeline, Rebecca noticed movement from the neighboring property. Diane Miller, her neighbor of 7 years, was watching them from behind her meticulously pruned hydrangea bushes. Unlike Rebecca's more casual approach to yard maintenance, Diane's garden was legendary in the neighborhood. Showpiece of perfect roses, sculptured shrubs, and not a weed in sight. The two women had always been cordial, if not close. Both had moved to Oak Ridge Estates after their respective divorces, seeking the quiet suburban life. Rebecca worked long hours at Memorial Hospital, while Diane, a retired elementary school teacher, dedicated herself to community garden club activities and volunteer work. They exchanged pleasantries at neighborhood gatherings and occasionally collected each other's mail during vacations, but their different lifestyles rarely intersected. When Diane emerged from behind the bushes and walked toward the property line, Rebecca waved with a smile. "Good morning, Diane. What do you think? I'm finally getting that pool I've talked about." Diane's expression remained neutral as her eyes traveled from the marked outline to the large equipment parked in Rebecca's driveway. "That seems quite substantial. I wasn't aware you were planning something so extensive." "I've been saving for years," Rebecca explained enthusiastically. "The crew starts excavation on Monday." "Monday?" Diane's eyebrows rose slightly. "I have my garden club meeting here Monday afternoon. Will it be very noisy?" Rebecca hadn't considered this. "I suppose there will be some noise during the excavation stage. It should only last a few days, though." Diane's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see. Well, I suppose I could relocate the meeting this once, though it is inconvenient on such short notice." "I'm sorry about that," Rebecca offered. "I should have mentioned it earlier." The conversation ended with stiff pleasantries, but as Diane walked back to her house, Rebecca noticed the rigid set of her neighbor's shoulders. She brushed aside a flicker of concern. Surely a few days of construction noise was a minor inconvenience that any reasonable neighbor would understand. What Rebecca couldn't see was Diane's view from her kitchen window, where the older woman stood silently calculating. The pool's position would place it directly in her sightline from her prized reading nook, replacing her carefully cultivated view of trees with what she imagined would be a noisy water feature and frequent gatherings. More troubling was the removal of the large oak that provided afternoon shade to her prized tea roses, a sacrifice necessary for the pool's insulation. That evening, Diane made 3 phone calls. One to reschedule her garden club meeting, another to the city planning office to inquire about permit requirements for residential pools, and a third to her friend on the homeowners association board. By Sunday night, a letter had been drafted requesting formal review of Rebecca's pool plans for compliance with neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. The first shots in their war had been fired, though neither woman yet recognized the escalation that would follow. Rebecca fell asleep that night dreaming of summer barbecues and moonlit swims, while Diane researched noise ordinances and water restriction regulations, determined to protect her sanctuary from what she perceived as an impending invasion of her peace. 3 weeks into the pool construction, Rebecca returned home from work to find a neatly folded piece of cream stationery tucked beneath her windshield wiper. The handwriting was impeccable, Diane's trademark cursive, honed through decades of teaching third graders. "Asterisk, I've been patient with the constant noise and dust, but today your contractors blocked my driveway for 2 hours while I had a doctor's appointment. Please show some consideration for your neighbors, asterisk." Rebecca sighed, watching as dust from the excavation drifted over the fence line toward Diane's property. The construction had indeed taken longer than expected, with permit delays and unexpected plumbing issues. She penned a quick apology note and dropped it in Diane's mailbox along with a gift card to the local nursery, a peace offering she hoped would smooth things over. The gesture went unacknowledged, and 3 days later, Rebecca's doorbell rang at 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday. She opened it to find Officer Patterson, a young policeman looking uncomfortable. "Ms. Sanders, we received a noise complaint. Your contractors apparently started work before the allowed time." Rebecca glanced at her watch, confused. "They're scheduled for 8 o'clock. No one's even here yet." The officer nodded, clearly expecting this response. "Well, someone reported power tools operating at 6:45 a.m. Since I'm here, I should remind you that residential construction can only occur between 8 o'clock a.m. and 7 o'clock p.m. on weekends." As he left, Rebecca spotted Diane watching from behind her living room curtains. The woman quickly disappeared when their eyes met. That evening, Tom Fletcher from across the street stopped by as Rebecca watered her front lawn. "Quite a project you got going," he commented. "Diane's been bending everyone's ear at the neighborhood association about it." He lowered his voice. "Just a heads up, she's circulating a petition about noise and environmental concerns from your pool. Something about water usage during conservation season." Rebecca's grip tightened on the garden hose. "She's what?" Tom shrugged apologetically. "She's got too much time on her hands, if you ask me. Ever since Harold passed, she's channeled everything into that garden and neighborhood rules." The next day, Rebecca installed a Bluetooth speaker system in her backyard and tested its volume, carefully staying within legal limits, with her workout playlist while Diane hosted her Sunday afternoon garden club. The looks from the group of older women as Rebecca stretched ostentatiously to heavy bass confirmed she'd made her point. Diane's retaliation came Tuesday with the installation of 3 motion-activated security lights positioned to illuminate Rebecca's backyard. That night, every time Rebecca stepped onto her patio, blinding floodlights activated, making stargazing impossible and attracting swarms of moths. When Rebecca complained, Diane smiled thinly. "I'm concerned about security with all those workmen coming and going. Surely you understand." By mid-July, with the pool finally completed, Rebecca hosted her first evening gathering. The party was deliberately modest, just 6 friends from work enjoying cocktails and the new underwater lighting system that changed colors every few minutes. At 9:58 p.m., 2 minutes before noise restrictions began, police cruisers appeared again, lights flashing. Another noise complaint. Officer Patterson explained, now on a first-name basis with Rebecca. "Look, between us, we've had 9 calls from your neighbor in the past month. None have shown any actual violations." Meanwhile, Diane had begun her most strategic move yet, planting a row of fast-growing bamboo along the property line. The species she selected, *Philostachys nigra*, was known for its aggressive root system that could potentially undermine cement structures nearby, including pool foundations. Rebecca discovered this fact during a Google search after finding bamboo rhizomes already spreading into her yard. The city's code enforcement office explained they couldn't intervene in landscaping disputes unless property was actively damaged. "She'll have to dig those up if they cross onto your property," the board clerk explained, "but she can plant whatever she wants on her side." That evening, Rebecca stood at her kitchen window, watching Diane meticulously water her bamboo at dusk. Their eyes met across the yard, and neither woman looked away. The cold, calculated stare they exchanged acknowledged what their conflict had become, no longer about a pool or noise or plants, but about winning at any cost. Late September brought a brief ceasefire to the neighborhood war. Rebecca's daughter, Allison, was struggling with her freshman year of college, and Rebecca had scheduled a long weekend visit to help her settle in. For the first time in months, she found herself thinking about something other than her feud with Diane. "I'll be gone Thursday through Monday," Rebecca mentioned to her friend Tricia over coffee on her patio. "Allison's having a hard time adjusting to dorm life." Tricia nodded sympathetically. "First semester's always tough. The house will be okay while you're gone." Rebecca glanced toward Diane's property, where the bamboo had grown nearly 8 feet tall in just months. "Tom across the street will collect my mail, and I've got the security system. What's the worst that could happen?" Neither woman noticed Diane watering her roses nearby, well within earshot. That night, Diane sat alone in her darkened living room, listening to the echoes of laughter from Rebecca's backyard, where a small group had gathered for an impromptu weeknight pool party. The rhythmic splashing and conversation carried clearly over the fence despite the bamboo barrier. Sleep had become elusive for Diane since the pool's completion, every splash, every laugh feeling like a personal affront. On her end table sat a bottle of sleeping pills prescribed after Harold's death 3 years ago. Beside it, an untouched glass of wine. The combination had been tempting on several recent nights. Instead, she reached for her laptop and began searching how to stop neighbors' pool noise for what must have been the 100th time. This time, however, her search took a darker turn as she typed "how to damage a swimming pool." The results were surprisingly detailed, from chemicals that could ruin the pH balance to more permanent solutions. One forum post caught her attention. *, my neighbor filled in his pool after foundation issues made it too expensive to maintain *. The seed planted, Diane found herself on a contractor's website, then making notes about costs. By dawn, she had formulated a plan born of exhaustion and festering resentment. Thursday morning, Rebecca departed for her daughter's college, her overnight bag in the trunk and thoughts focused entirely on helping Allison. As her car disappeared down the street, Diane watched from behind her curtains, phone already in hand. 2 hours later, a white truck bearing the logo Peterson's Concrete Solutions pulled into the neighborhood. The foreman, a heavy-set man named Carl, checked the address against his clipboard as Diane approached him at the curb. You're right on time, she said, extending her hand. I'm Diane Miller. Carl looked confused. We have an order for Rebecca Sanders at this address. Something about filling a pool? Diane smiled smoothly. Yes, I'm her sister. Rebecca had a family emergency and had to leave town suddenly. I'm handling the contractor arrangements while she's gone. She produced a folder of papers. She's been having second thoughts about the pool since installation, maintenance costs are higher than expected, and there have been some issues with the foundation. She decided it's best to fill it in before things get worse. Carl studied the papers, printouts of pool specifications that Diane had photographed during construction months earlier when workers had left documents on Rebecca's patio table. Nothing looked official, but the details matched what his company had been told when scheduling the job. Usually the homeowner has to sign off on this kind of work, he said hesitantly. Diane's expression turned sympathetic but firm. I understand your concern. Rebecca mentioned you might need confirmation. She pulled out her phone and showed him text messages, carefully fabricated in a fake text generator, showing a conversation about filling in the pool. She's at her daughter's college orientation and reception today, so she can't take calls. That's why she asked me to oversee this. Diane sighed dramatically. She's quite upset about wasting so much money on something that's become a neighborhood nuisance. Still looking uncertain, Carl made a perfunctory call to the office, confirming that payment had been processed for the job. Diane had used her entire savings to pay the significant deposit through an online portal the previous day. Monday afternoon, Rebecca Sidden pulled into her driveway. The weekend with Allison had been productive. They'd reorganized her dorm room, established a study schedule, and even found a counselor for the homesickness that had been overwhelming her daughter. For the first time in weeks, Rebecca felt a sense of accomplishment and peace. That feeling evaporated the moment she stepped into her backyard, where her shimmering pool had been. The centerpiece of her backyard, her symbol of independence, now lay a flat gray concrete slab. Rebecca froze, her mind unable to process the transformation. She blinked repeatedly, as if the concrete might dissolve and reveal the pool beneath. What? The word emerged as barely a whisper. She approached the edge of the slab, noticing the hastily finished edges where concrete met her patio stones. Dropping to her knees, she ran her fingers over the rough surface, still smelling faintly of chemicals. Disbelief gave way to confusion, then to a dawning horror as realization set in. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and called the police. Officer Patterson arrived 20 minutes later, his eyes widening as Rebecca led him to the backyard. I don't understand, she repeated, her voice hollow. I was gone for 4 days. 4 days. Miss Sanders, do you have security cameras? He asked, already taking notes. Rebecca nodded mechanically. Yes. Front door, side gate, and one covering the pool area. Her voice caught on the last word. The pool that's gone. Inside, Rebecca pulled up the security app on her tablet. With Officer Patterson watching, she navigated to Friday's footage. The time-lapse video revealed everything. Workers arriving, draining equipment being set up, and there, directing it all, was Diane Miller, gesturing and pointing as if she owned the property. That's my neighbor, Rebecca said, her shock giving way to rage. That's Diane. The footage continued through Saturday, showing concrete trucks arriving, workers pouring the gray slurry into what had been her pool, and Diane supervising the entire process. The final clip showed Diane standing alone on the fresh concrete, arms folded, surveying her work with what appeared to be satisfaction. Officer Patterson's expression hardened. Ma'am, this is clear evidence of criminal property damage. I'd estimate we're looking at, what was the value of the pool? $65,000, Rebecca whispered, plus the landscaping, the lighting system, the heating equipment. I need to call this in, he said, reaching for his radio. This is felony-level property damage. We'll need statements and to secure this footage. While the officer called for backup, Rebecca sat motionless at her kitchen table, staring out the window toward Diane's house. She could see her neighbor moving about in her kitchen, apparently unaware that Rebecca had returned. 2 hours later, Diane's home became the center of neighborhood attention as 3 police cruisers parked outside. From her living room window, Rebecca watched as officers led Diane out in handcuffs, the older woman's face a mask of defiance even as neighbors emerged to witness her humiliation. Just before being placed in the police car, Diane locked eyes with Rebecca across the yard. Instead of remorse or fear, Rebecca saw only cold satisfaction in her neighbor's expression. She's not even sorry, Rebecca murmured to the insurance adjuster who had arrived to begin assessing the damage. The adjuster, a heavy-set man who had introduced himself as Greg, shook his head as he photographed the concrete slab. In 23 years doing this job, I've seen neighbor disputes lead to slashed tires, broken windows, even a chainsaw taken to a shared fence once. But this, he whistled low, this is something else. Later that evening, Rebecca sat alone on her patio, staring at the gray monolith that had replaced her dream. The insurance company had already confirmed they would cover the destruction minus her deductible, but explained that reconstruction would take months. The police had taken her statement and assured her that criminal charges would proceed given the overwhelming video evidence. Yet none of it brought her comfort. In the gathering twilight, Rebecca realized that beyond the financial loss and inconvenience, something fundamental had changed. The home that had represented her fresh start, her sanctuary after divorce, now felt violated in a way that no insurance payout could remedy. As darkness fell, lights came on across the neighborhood, except at Diane's house, which remained dark, its owner still in police custody. Rebecca poured herself a glass of wine and made a decision. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. This was about justice, consequences, and ensuring that Diane Miller understood exactly what her vindictive act had cost, not just in dollars, but in shattered security and peace of mind. The county courthouse stood imposingly against the autumn sky as Rebecca climbed the stone steps, her attorney Michael Brennan at her side. 3 months had passed since she returned home to find her pool replaced by concrete, and today marked Diane's criminal sentencing hearing. Remember, Michael murmured as they passed through security, the DA has already secured a guilty plea. Today is just formality. Rebecca nodded, clutching her victim impact statement. She'd rewritten it 7 times, struggling to articulate how Diane's actions had affected her life beyond the obvious financial damage. The courtroom was surprisingly crowded. Rebecca recognized several neighbors, a few reporters from local papers, and unexpectedly, her ex-husband Mark seated in the back row. He nodded slightly when their eyes met. Diane sat at the defendant's table wearing a conservative navy dress that emphasized her thinness. The months since her arrest had visibly aged her. Beside her, a public defender organized papers looking harried. Judge Eleanor Watkins, a stern woman in her 60s known for her no-nonsense approach, called the court to order. The proceedings moved quickly through formalities until the prosecutor summarized the case. Your Honor, the defendant has pleaded guilty to criminal destruction of property exceeding $50,000 in value. The state has video evidence showing Ms. Miller impersonating the victim's representative to contractors, deliberately misleading them into destroying a swimming pool valued at $65,743. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated act requiring planning and deception. When Rebecca's turn came to deliver her impact statement, she approached the podium with steady steps. Your Honor, when I installed that pool, it represented starting over after my divorce. It was the first major decision I made completely on my own. She paused, collecting herself. What Ms. Miller took wasn't just property, it was my sense of safety in my own home. I now have security cameras in every room. I check them obsessively. I've lost weight, lost sleep, and lost my peace of mind knowing that someone I lived beside for years could so methodically violate my property while I was helping my daughter. Diane stared straight ahead, her posture rigid as Rebecca continued. The financial impact extends beyond the pool itself. I've missed work for court appearances and meetings with investigators. I paid for therapy to deal with anxiety. Even with insurance coverage, the deductible and uncovered expenses exceed $12,000. But more than money, I've lost my neighborhood. Neighbors have taken sides. Some believe Ms. Miller was justified because they found my pool parties annoying. Judge Watkins listened intently, occasionally making notes. When Rebecca finished, the judge turned to Diane. Ms. Miller, would you like to address the court before sentencing? Diane rose slowly, her hands gripping the table. Your Honor, I recognize my actions were inappropriate. Her voice was thin but controlled. I was not thinking clearly due to sleep deprivation caused by months of disruption. I accept responsibility, but ask the court to consider that I've never had any prior legal issues in my 67 years. The judge's expression remained impassive as she delivered her ruling. Ms. Miller, this court finds your actions particularly disturbing because they were premeditated and executed through deception. You didn't act in a moment of passion. You researched, planned, and implemented the destruction of your neighbor's property over multiple days. Judge Watkins leaned forward. Citizens cannot take property disputes into their own hands. The sentence came swiftly. 3 years probation, mandatory psychological counseling, full restitution of $65,743 for the pool, plus $12,480 for Rebecca's additional expenses, and 250 hours of community service. Should you violate any terms of this probation, Ms. Miller, you will serve 18 months in state prison, the judge concluded. As court adjourned, Rebecca felt oddly hollow. The moment she'd anticipated for months had arrived, yet brought no satisfaction. Outside on the courthouse steps, her attorney pulled her aside. The criminal case is settled, but there's still the civil suit. Given today's outcome, we're in a strong position to pursue punitive damages. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday bearing the letterhead of Brennan and Associates. Diane's hands trembled as she opened it, already anticipating its contents. The civil judgment had been finalized, $217,563 awarded to Rebecca Sanders for property damage, emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages. Diane sank into her armchair, the one Harold had occupied for 20 years before his heart attack. Her retirement income, a modest teacher's pension, and Social Security totaled $3,274 monthly. The mortgage on her carefully maintained colonial-style home consumed nearly half that amount. "This is impossible," she whispered to the empty room. The following morning, she met with a financial advisor recommended by her public defender. The young woman reviewed Diane's finances with a furrowed brow before delivering the verdict. "Ms. Miller, there's no way to structure payments that would satisfy this judgment without liquidating assets. The court has already placed a lien on your home." Her tone was sympathetically professional. "You have approximately $42,000 in retirement savings. That would cover less than 20% of the judgment." "What about bankruptcy?" Diane asked, the word feeling like ash in her mouth. "Unfortunately, judgments for intentional torts, like willful property destruction, generally can't be discharged through bankruptcy." The advisor slid a notepad across the desk. "These are your options as I see them." The list was brutally short. Sell a house voluntarily or face foreclosure, liquidate retirement accounts, establish a court-approved payment plan for the remaining balance, and downsize dramatically. That night, Diane sat at her kitchen table surrounded by household bills. The electricity notice showed an overdue balance. She had forgotten to pay it amid the legal chaos. Her homeowner's insurance had sent a cancellation notice, citing the criminal conviction as grounds for termination. Without insurance, the mortgage company would force-place a policy at 3 times the normal premium. The financial vise tightened further 2 days later when her bank notified her that $2,142, nearly all her remaining checking account balance, had been garnished per court order. The automatic mortgage payments scheduled for the following week would bounce. "You need to understand the severity of this situation," explained Carmen Rodriguez, a loss mitigation specialist at First Horizon Bank, during their phone consultation. "You're heading toward foreclosure unless immediate arrangements are made." Diane's proud resistance finally crumbled. She called her son Michael, who lived 2 hours away. Their relationship had been strained since Harold's death. Michael had never understood why his mother refused to sell the too-large house and move closer to his family. "I saw something in the local paper online," Michael said when he answered, his voice carefully neutral. "Something about a lawsuit and a swimming pool. The dam broke." Through tears, Diane explained everything: the sleepless nights, the growing obsession, the impulsive decision, and now the catastrophic financial consequences. The silence that followed her confession stretched painfully. "Jesus, Mom," Michael finally said. "Why didn't you just call me when this started? Or see someone? Or move?" "I don't know," she whispered. "It just escalated." 3 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in Diane's front yard. The real estate market had cooled significantly, and the lion on the property complicated matters. When the first offer came in at 22% below asking price, Diane had no choice but to accept. The closing process moved with agonizing slowness. Meanwhile, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings after the 3rd missed mortgage payment. Diane's credit score, once an impressive 812, plummeted below 520. On moving day, Diane stood in her empty living room, surrounded by labeled boxes containing what remained of 40 years of accumulation. Most of her furniture had been sold to help cover moving expenses. The prize antique dining set, a wedding gift from Harold's parents, had gone to a young couple for less than a quarter of its value. The sale of the house had yielded enough to pay off the mortgage and cover approximately 60% of the judgment against her. The remaining balance would follow her for years, with court-ordered payments consuming nearly a third of her monthly income. Michael arrived with a rented truck, his expression a mixture of frustration, pity, and resignation. "The spare room is set up," he said, lifting a box labeled Kitchen Essentials. "Katie cleared some closet space for your things." Diane nodded silently, running her hand along the crown molding she and Harold had installed together 30 years earlier. The weight of the day, the months of financial disintegration, pressed down on her as she followed her son out the door, leaving her keys on the counter for the new owners.